Chapter 11. Higher Still. I was sufficiently rested the next day to set out for Camp 4, which was visible just below the skyline, a single small black dot in a white wilderness. I was now on the face of the mountain itself, and the ground was steeper than it had been on the ridge and swept by an icy wind. I moved slowly, my knees trembled, my feet turned to 10 past 10. I frequently fell on my face. This, added to the fact that I no longer felt a desire to look for warples, led me to suspect that I was weakening. I found that my thoughts would rise no higher than my stomach or the next step, whichever was lower. I was losing control of my destiny and the expedition. This would never do. When the leader gives up, the team falls to pieces. Who knew what struggles were going on below me? Was it to be the one to fail, the party? No, I said, I would not fail. I said it was time I stopped feeling sorry for myself. I had been telling myself that I was miserable, and being a naturally truthful person, I had believed myself. The remedy was plain. I must tell myself something cheerful. I told myself that my knees were firm and my feet straight. I told myself that I was gaining strength with every step. I said that my stomach acne was hardly worth thinking about. I said I was all eagerness to find warples. I talked to myself all day. I think I was on the point of convincing myself when, sometime in the late afternoon, I fancied my eyes were getting weak and beginning to fear snow blindness. I told myself that it was all imagination. I tried hard to convince myself of this, and it did at last seem that my eyes were improving, but when we reached Camp 4, I found my goggles had frosted over. I found Wish in residence. He gave me a long and interesting list of scientific apparatus he had seen during the previous day's climb. He kept me quite busy writing it all down. I would reproduce the list here, but it is not likely to be of general interest, being very like a manufacturer's catalog. I told Wish that I intended to spend one day at Camp 4 to acclimatize, then push on as quickly as possible in order to make maximum height before my strength gave out. I said I hoped he would accompany me. Wish said that was exactly what he himself would have liked to do. Unfortunately, he had deteriorated during his stay at Camp 4 and must go down to recuperate. He added that this would probably enable him from Camp 3 to relay messages between myself at Camp 4 and those lower down. It was, he said, essential to make contact with others, and this was only practicable way of doing it. I hope I am not being self-indulgent when I describe to the effects of altitude my temporary irritation with Wish's logical conclusions. I recognized the truth of what he said, but it seemed to me at the time that truth and Wish had ganged up against me. This was ungracious of me, particularly in view of Wish's sympathy in a similar situation at Camp 3. After a frugal supper of lentils and pemmican, I found myself sufficiently restored to make inner amends to Wish. This put me in the mood for a good talk, and Wish, being a scientist and used to dealing directly with truth, I saw no harm in confessing outright my interest in the matrimonial state of the party and asking him if he himself had a fiancée. He replied that it was an interesting point. I said yes it was, and then we fell silent. After a while I reminded him that he had not answered my question and said I hoped he had not taken offense at anything I might have said. He said no, on the contrary, he was touched by my interest. The fact was, it was not quite clear to him either. I said I would be very happy if he would confide in me. He then told me his story, but slowly and with difficulty. Poor fellow, his emotion was so strong that the words did not come easily. He had, he said, always wanted a fiancée. Even as a child it had been his heart's desire. He had always asked Father Christmas to send him one, and repeated disappointments had caused him to develop at an early age a sense of disillusion which many a mature man might have envied. When he discovered Father Christmas did not, in fact, exist, he decided in his small mind that he could no longer place any trust in his parents. From this, it was but a short step to doubting everything that was told to him. By his 6th birthday, he was a complete skeptic. He asked me if I could understand his feelings. I said yes. A sensitive and intelligent child might easily react in this way. I myself had had long doubts about the advisability of Father Christmas, and Wish's experience was of great interest to me. I begged him to continue. At the age of 7, he asked his father to tell him the fact of life, with particular references to finances. But he found it quite impossible to believe what was told him. It seemed to him, he said, much more unlikely than Father Christmas. In his great bewilderment, he consulted some of his small friend, who, equally puzzled, approached their own parents on the subject. The explanations they brought him were so varied and contradictory that the poor child was confirmed in his opinion that the whole thing was just another fairy tale. He became convinced that fiancés were no more real than Father Christmas. The parents of his small friends had become alarmed by the sudden outbreak of interest in this delicate subject. Having discovered the author, they held a meeting, and after much careful thought, they clubbed together and bought the boy a catapult, hoping that it would take his mind away from other things. Except for the additional expense of broken windows, they were quite satisfied with the result. The boy's natural delight at owning a weapon of destruction drew his attention away from the subject of finances, thus relieving an inner tension which might well have resulted in a political career. The boy's natural delight at owning a weapon of destruction drew his attention away from the subject of fiancés, thus relieving the inner tension which might well have resulted in a political career. Masterful. Some years later, during his student days, his interest in the subject was reawakened by a chance remark made by a servant girl. By consulting works of reference and talking to many authorities, he acquired an exhaustive knowledge of current beliefs. But his skepticism was still more robust than his credulity. In spite of a strong and self-confessed desire to believe, he found it impossible to do so. It seemed, he said, that he alone of the human race was able to see the uncomfortable truth, to stand outside the cozy glow of illusion. He began to believe that his mission in life was to disclose to mankind the light which had revealed itself to him alone. He spoke eloquently and often in discussion and debate, and founded a group known as Whence, whose motto was Whither. He even wrote a monograph entitled Fiancés, the pathetic myth, which was published by the Sensible Press and remaindered in 10 editions. He was sent down from university for steadfastly refusing to believe anything which was taught him. The Whentians gave him a public send-off and proclaimed him the first martyr of the new lack of faith. But having come down, he found, as many a young man had found before him, that the world of men and affairs was a vastly different place from the world of his imaginings. His first rude awakening occurred one Saturday afternoon in the saloon bar of the Psychic Squirrel. Wish had been holding forth in his usual way, and, he thought, expounded his theory of skepticism with particular clarity and brilliance. When he had finished, elderly, rather disreputable-looking gentleman of the eccentric type spoke with a few quiet sentences which quite removed Wish's self-satisfaction. He said he would not deny that Wish showed certain glimmerings of promise as a skeptic, but he had far to go. He must learn the elemental truth that real skeptic is skeptical by character rather than conviction. The intellectual drapery in which he clothes his skepticism has as little importance with the demonstrations of the believer. It is indeed more likely to veil than reveal the naked truth. Moreover, knowing that his mind will enable him to doubt everything, the skeptic scorns the crudity of stating his disbelief. He merely lives it. But when this, the gentleman said, was going too far, the true skeptic would refuse even to believe in himself and his own skepticism. He would maintain an openness of mind indistinguishable from complete mindlessness, and an openness of character indistinguishable from utter lack of character. His skepticism would find its ultimate expression in the acceptance of random prejudice as being as sound a basis for living as the most carefully reasoned philosophy. This, he said, was the ultimate faith. For it scorned intellectual pretext. He said that the true skeptic was far stronger in faith than any believer. Wish left the Psychic Squirrel a very confused man. He spent a wretched night and awoke with a violent headache and a strong prejudice against alcoholic refreshment in any form and casual conversations with eccentric strangers. This prejudice was the turning point in his life. There was, he said, no arguing about it. Sense or nonsense, it was completely convincing to him. This was a revelation. He reasoned that since he must live by prejudice, he might as well choose the most comfortable ones he could find. He started to look around him, scrutinizing carefully every prejudice he came across, no matter how worn or dilapidated it might appear. He examined thousands, some soft and comfortable, some sharp and excruciating. Prejudice is large, prejudice is small, prejudice is personal, national, harmless, deadly, ancient, modern, scientific, superstitious, plebeian, aristocratic, practical, useless, orthodox, heretical. Prejudice is galore and free for the taking. He felt, he said, like an explorer who comes upon a treasure chest crammed with the richest and most beautiful gems. He picked here and there, deliberately taking his time. He chose a complete set of prejudices which could last him a lifetime and fit him to deal with any situation. He chose his career. He joined a political party. The pride of his collection was his old heart's desire, the craving for a fiancée. Prejudice had restored what reason had banished. Happily, reverentially, with a feeling of miracles performed, he put it back in its old place. It didn't fit. He turned it this way and that. He examined it for wear. He reasoned with himself, read long passages from textbooks. He lied to himself. He took advice from anybody who would tell him what he wanted to hear. All in vain. Wish said he wondered if I could appreciate his feelings. He had, he said, convinced himself beyond all reasonable doubt that the popular view was the correct one. He could prove it to himself by every known intellectual test. Moreover, he wanted to believe it. In a sense, he did believe it, but not completely. There was always a reserve at the back of his mind, and as time went on, this emerged as a conviction that the whole thing was a plot to deceive him, a vast plot which included the writers of books and Wish's own friends. He asked me if I thought him over fanciful. I said that on the contrary, I found it extremely interesting, having myself had an experience very similar to his, though perhaps less intense. It happened while I was on my way to Scotland to join some friends for a climbing holiday. Halfway up the Great North Road, I was traveling by bicycle. I began to suspect that Scotland did not exist, that it had been invented just to make a fool of me. All the books I had read, all the stories about thrifty Scotsmen, Shakespeare's Macbeth, Rabbie Burns, songs about Loch Lomond and Bonnie Charlie, all of these were part of the conspiracy. The northerners who pretended to come from Scotland were all in on the plot. Their accent had been invented for the purpose. I was almost convinced that at Berwick-on-Tweed I would be laughed at by thousands of practical jokers whose entire lives have been devoted to bringing about this one ridiculous event. I became so apprehensive I was unable to continue my journey by cycle. I thought that if I went by train I should avoid exposure, for if Scotland really did not exist, the railway company certainly would know about it and would not issue a ticket. But when I got to the booking office, I realized that if this was the case, I should look just as foolish trying to buy a ticket as if I tried to cycle to Scotland with no possible chance of pretending that I had no real intention of going further than the border. I realized, too, that if there was actually a conspiracy, the railway company would be in on it and would have false tickets ready at every booking office in case I came along. But it was too late to turn back. I bought a ticket to Berwick, and almost sure that the clerk looked disappointed. Once on the train, I made discreet inquiries of officials and my fellow travelers, besides examining labels on the luggage van, and decided that if it was all part of the conspiracy, it was a remarkable, thorough business. I decided that Scotland was a calculated risk worth taking. At Berwick, I left the train and cycled over the border. Wish said that this was exactly the sort of thing he had experienced in regard to fiancées. Unfortunately, he'd been able to find no easy solution such as mine. Shortly after the encounter at the Psychic Squirrel, he had met a young person who, he said, was exactly the kind of person he would have wished to have had as a fiancée if he could have persuaded himself to believe in them. So strong were his feelings that he decided to risk exposure by asking her to be his. To his great delight, she promised to do so. This occurred just before we left England. For a few days, Wish was the happiest mountaineer alive. His dearest childhood dream had been realized. He was almost ready to believe in Father Christmas. Then came doubt. Was it true? Could it be true? Was his fiancée perhaps in the conspiracy? Would he, on our return home, be exposed to a nation's ridicule? Since then, he had been torn between love and fear, and had not known a moment's of peace. Nobody, he said, could possibly imagine the torments he had borne. He groaned in a most distressing way. Poor fellow! I tried to reassure him that his fears were all fancies, but what could I do against the skepticism of a lifetime? I told him I wouldn't be happy until I put his mind at ease. I begged him to let me share his thoughts and help him in his struggle. He was pathetically grateful, but would not hear of it. I had, I said, enough responsibility already. He must bear his burden as best he could and face the issue manfully on his return to England. He thanked me for listening to him, but said that it would make it easier for him if we did not refer to the matter again. I promised, but with a lump in my throat I vowed to myself I would think less about my own troubles in the future.